That dinner cost $5,000 per plate, yet the cheapest thing in the room was my fiancé's word. Amidst the soft strains of classical music, Mark set his glass down and looked me dead in the eye with a gaze full of weary disdain. He spoke loudly enough to make the entire table fall silent. "Sam, you are terrifyingly dull. Can't you at least pretend to have a shred of intellect so I don't have to feel ashamed in front of my friends?" The giggles began to spread like a virus. Women draped in diamonds looked at me with patronizing pity, while the men glanced at Mark as if he had just scored a spectacular goal. Mark was savoring the moment he used me as a stepping stone to assert his own dominance. He thought I was merely the background for his brilliance. He had forgotten that for the last 7 years, I was the one who ghostwrote every speech, handpicked every tie, and scrubbed every stain from his past to transform him from a low-rent broker into a respected CEO. I didn't resist. I simply placed my napkin on the table and smiled a smile that, had Mark been intelligent enough, would have made his blood run cold. I was looking at a defective product, and I had just decided it was time for a recall. Do not look away. This is not the story of a heartbroken woman. This is the autopsy of a collapsing empire. I am going to show you how I pulled every single brick from the foundation of the name Mark Davenport, leaving him to wonder why his entire world disintegrated in a single night. If you want to know the true lethal power of silence, keep listening, because today this boring woman is calling in the debt with an interest rate he will never be able to afford. My name is Sam, a 38-year-old reputation architect whose name is whispered in the corridors of power when the world's most influential figures find their legacies teetering on the edge of ruin. For over a decade, I have operated in the shadows, neutralizing scandals and curating the public identities of people who are far more famous and far less capable than they appear. While I spend my days protecting the giants of industry, my nights for the last 7 years have been spent on a far more personal project, transforming Mark Davenport from a mediocre man with a messy history into the polished CEO the world now admires. The private dining room at the Gilded Oak was a vacuum of high-stakes social theater smelling of expensive cedar and the metallic tang of old money. Silicon Valley's tech elite sat shoulder to shoulder with generational wealth, their conversations a rhythmic hum of acquisitions and venture capital. I sat at Mark's right hand wearing a charcoal silk dress that was designed to be elegant but entirely forgettable. In this room, my role was clear. I was the quiet, supportive fiancé, the silent witness who made Mark look grounded and stable. To the venture capitalists leaning over their sea bass, I was merely arm candy that didn't demand too much of their attention. They saw a boring woman. I saw a room full of data points. As the evening progressed, I conducted a silent audit of the table. I watched the way the lead investor for a prominent firm touched his wedding ring, only when his assistant walked into the room. I noted the slight tremor in the hands of the young billionaire who was over-leveraged and desperate for a bailout. I wasn't just sitting there. I was mapping the nervous system of the room, identifying every hidden vulnerability and every unspoken alliance. I knew exactly who was influential and who was merely a loud distraction. I was the most dangerous person in the room precisely because everyone felt safe enough to ignore me. Then the air shifted. Mark buoyed by 2 glasses of vintage Bordeaux, and the rapt attention of his peers decided to perform. It started with a joke about his morning routine, which evolved into a boast about his latest quarterly earnings. But when the conversation turned to the importance of dynamic partnerships, he pivoted toward me. He looked at me with a weary, patronizing disdain that silenced the table. He didn't just speak, he projected. He told me I was terrifyingly dull, and asked if I could at least pretend to have a shred of intellect so he wouldn't have to feel ashamed in front of his friends. The laughter that followed was a slow, agonizing ripple. It didn't break out because Mark was particularly witty. It erupted because the room understood the hierarchy of power. They were aligning themselves with the man they believed held the keys to the next big IPO. I sat perfectly still, a masterclass in poise, feeling the collective weight of their pity and their mockery. I didn't flinch. I didn't reach for my glass or look at the floor. Instead, I opened a mental ledger. I recorded the sharp, high-pitched giggle of the woman across from us who wanted Mark's business. I noted the deep, booming chuckle of the mentor Mark admired, who laughed out of a sense of masculine solidarity. I even memorized the way the server looked away embarrassed for me. Mark leaned back, his chest puffed out, basking in the social approval he had just bought with my dignity. He thought he was the king of the mountain, but I was looking at a man who had finally made a fatal miscalculation. I turned the number over in my mind, 3. This was the third time he had crossed the line. The first time had been 6 months ago, a sharp comment about my lack of ambition delivered in the privacy of our kitchen. I had categorized that as a mistake, a byproduct of his stress. The second time was during a weekend in the Hamptons with his brothers, where he made a derogatory remark about my simple background. I had viewed that as a choice, a calculated attempt to elevate himself in their eyes. But this third time, under the vaulted ceilings of a room, where every word could change a stock price, it was a strategic declaration. By humiliating me publicly, Mark was signaling that he had outgrown me. He believed he had reached a level of success where he no longer needed the architect who had built his foundation. He thought he was the statue, and I was merely the scaffolding that could now be discarded. What he failed to realize is that when you pull the scaffolding away too early, the statue doesn't just fall. It shatters into a million unrecognizable pieces. I looked at Mark's grinning, triumphant face and felt a cold, clinical clarity take hold of me. He wanted interesting. I was about to give him the most captivating, terrifying experience of his life. 3 times is not a mistake. It's a blueprint. And in my world, once I see the blueprint, I know exactly how to bring the building down. As the dinner party wound down and the guests began to stand their chairs scraping against the hardwood like a chorus of small grating violins, I maintained my facade of the placid, supportive partner. I walked to the cloakroom with Mark allowing him to guide me by the elbow as if I were a fragile piece of porcelain he barely valued. He was still riding the high of his public performance, his laughter a bit too loud, his movements expansive and arrogant. He didn't offer an apology for his remarks, nor did he look at me with anything resembling remorse. To him, I was just Sam, the quiet woman who organized his life and filled the space beside him. He had no inkling that the woman he had just ridiculed was actually one of the most feared and respected fixers in the upper echelons of American industry. My true identity as a reputation architect for the top 0.1% was a secret I guarded with the same clinical precision I used to bury the scandals of my clients. While the world saw a dull fiancé, my real life was spent in windowless boardrooms and encrypted calls deciding which CEOs stayed in power and which families were allowed to keep their generational wealth after a disaster. In my profession, being boring is not a character flaw, it is a tactical choice. The most powerful people I know are rarely the loudest in the room. True power is the person who listens, the person who observes, and the person who knows exactly where the bodies are buried because they were the one who dug the hole. My clients call me when a sex scandal threatens a merger or when a high-ranking executive's past indiscretions are about to be leaked to the press. I am the ghost who makes the impossible disappear. I had spent 15 years perfecting the art of being invisible so that I could work my magic without leaving a fingerprint. This was the professional camouflage I had maintained throughout my relationship with Mark. I had let him believe he was the star of the show because in my world, the star is always the most vulnerable target. By staying in the shadows, I held all the leverage. Mark hadn't been dating a quiet, simple woman. He had been living with a woman who held the keys to his world and the secrets of people far more powerful than he could ever dream of becoming. The irony of Mark's disdain was that he was essentially a product of my labor, a piece of art that I had spent 7 years painstakingly restoring. When I met him, Mark was a failing entrepreneur with a reputation that was effectively radioactive. He was a low-rent broker with a history of questionable ethics and a penchant for making enemies in all the wrong places. His wardrobe was cheap, his speech was unrefined, and his professional prospects were non-existent. I saw him as a challenge, a raw piece of marble that I could carve into something magnificent. I sanitized his history using my connections to bury the lawsuits and non-disclosure agreements that would have ended his career before it began. I curated his every public appearance, from the bespoke suits he wore to the specific phrasing he used in every high-stakes negotiation. I was the one who coached him on how to speak to investors, teaching him the subtle linguistic cues that signal authority and competence. I opened doors for him that were locked tight to men of his background, leveraging my own silent reputation to get him into the exclusive clubs and private dinners where real power is exchanged. Every success he had enjoyed over the last 7 years was a direct result of my professional expertise. I had transformed him into a man of stature, a CEO who looked like he had been born for the role. Yet as he ascended, his memory faded. He began to believe the myth I had created for him. He started to think that the doors had opened because of his own charm, that the scandals had stayed buried because of his own luck, and that the speeches he delivered so flawlessly were a product of his own intellect. He had forgotten the architect while standing in the middle of the cathedral. His arrogance grew in direct proportion to his success, and as he became more convinced of his own greatness, he began to view me as an anchor rather than a foundation. He took my silence for a lack of depth and my unwavering support for a lack of options. To Mark, I had become a safety net, something that was always there to catch him, but something he felt he could eventually step over or discard without consequence. This was the ultimate misalignment of power. Mark was insulting the only person in the world who knew exactly how fragile his empire truly was. He was biting the hand that had fed him, protected him, and hidden the stains of his past. He didn't understand that the very reputation he used as a weapon against me at dinner was a fragile construct held together by my constant invisible maintenance. Without me, he was just a broker with a messy past and a trail of enemies waiting for a weakness to exploit. He looked at me in the car on the way home, his expression one of bored indifference, and I realized that he felt entirely safe in his disrespect. He thought he was the one in control, the one who determined my value in the social marketplace. He had no idea that I was already calculating the cost of his exit. I was not a woman who reacted with tears or screams. I was a woman who reacted with a cold, systematic withdrawal of my protection. I watched the city lights flicker across his face, a face I had essentially designed, and I felt the final tether of my loyalty snap. He wanted to see what happened when the boring woman stopped being interesting. He was about to find out. They thought I was quiet because I had nothing to say. They didn't realize I was deciding if they were still worth the effort of my protection. The decision was made with the same surgical detachment I used when advising a Fortune 500 board to terminate a beloved but reckless founder. I didn't pack a bag or stage a dramatic exit. Instead, I woke up the next morning, adjusted the 3-carat diamond on my finger that now felt more like a shackle than a promise, and prepared Mark's coffee exactly the way he liked it. I remained in our sprawling penthouse, a ghost in a house of cards, maintaining the perfect status quo to ensure he remained unsuspecting. Mark, oblivious to the shift in the atmosphere, moved through the rooms with his usual swagger, already forgetting the insults he had hurled at the dinner party as if they were nothing more than light conversation. He believed my continued presence was a sign of my submission, a confirmation that I was indeed the dull, dependent woman he could belittle without consequence. He had no idea that I had already initiated the withdrawal. I didn't need to attack him or leak his secrets to the press. I simply had to stop doing the invisible work that kept his world spinning. I stopped ghostwriting the witty, insightful emails that made him look like a visionary to his investors. I stopped reminding him of the subtle social cues he habitually missed, the small gestures of respect that maintained his fragile alliances. Most importantly, I stopped my pre-clearing sessions with the wives of his business partners. In the upper tiers of American society, the boardroom is only half the battle. The real gatekeepers are the women who decide which families are acceptable and which are social liabilities. For 7 years, I had quietly managed those relationships, smoothing over Mark's rough edges and ensuring he was always welcomed into the inner circle. Now I let the silence settle. The first cracks in his carefully constructed armor appeared within a week, small and seemingly unrelated, like the first few pebbles falling before a landslide. A major contract negotiation with a legacy firm, a deal Mark had been bragging about for months, suddenly stalled. Usually, I would have spent the evening before the meeting drilling him on the lead negotiator's personal history and providing the exact psychological hook needed to close the deal. This time, I merely smiled and told him he would be brilliant. He walked into that boardroom with his usual arrogance but without my intelligence, and he faltered. He couldn't read the room, missed the subtle shifts in tone, and left the meeting without a signature, confused and frustrated. 2 days later, a dinner invitation from one of the city's most influential old money families was mysteriously rescinded. Mark was baffled, pacing the living room and checking his phone every 5 minutes, blaming bad luck, a volatile market, or some phantom clerical error. He failed to see that the invisible shield I had built around him had been lowered by just an inch, and in our world, an inch is more than enough for the wolves to pick up the scent of weakness. He was a man who had been walking on water for 7 years, never realizing I was the one freezing the surface beneath his feet. Watching the decay of his professional and social standing was like observing a clinical trial from behind a one-way mirror. I maintained my role as the supportive, quiet fiancé, listening to his rants about the incompetence of his partners and the fickle nature of his peers with a practiced expression of sympathy. Inside, I was recording the data with the cold precision of a scientist. I saw the rising anxiety in the way he gripped his glass, the way his voice took on a desperate, sharper edge when he spoke to his associates. He tried to exert the power he believed he possessed, barking orders and making demands only to realize that his words no longer carried the weight they once did. Without my silent endorsements whispering in the ears of the right people, Mark was discovering that his charisma was a hollow vessel. People weren't just following him, they had been following the version of him that I had validated. Without that validation, he was just a loud man in an expensive suit, and the elite circles he once dominated were beginning to close their ranks against him. He was like a patient whose body was slowly rejecting a vital organ, unaware that the surgeon who had performed the transplant was now the one watching the system fail. Mark's desperation began to manifest as a frantic need to prove he was still in control. He scheduled more meetings, made riskier promises, and tried to bully his way back into the favor of the gatekeepers. But the more he struggled, the more he alienated the very people he needed to impress. I watched him at a charity gala standing on the edge of a conversation he would have normally led, his face flushed with the realization that he was being politely but firmly excluded. He looked toward me, seeking the social rescue I had provided 1,000 times before, but I was busy admiring the floral arrangements, offering him nothing but a blank, pleasant stare. The power dynamic had shifted so fundamentally that he was now the one gasping for air in a room where I breathed perfectly fine. He didn't understand that I was the source of his oxygen, and I had simply decided to turn off the valve. He was still the man the world saw as a success, but the foundation was rotting in real time. I didn't have to push him toward the edge. I just had to stop holding his hand while he walked toward it. Mark finally felt the walls closing in, though he still lacked the wisdom to understand who had built them. Sensing my growing emotional distance and the inexplicable coldness from his business associates, he did what every cornered egoist does. He attempted to seize the narrative. He began a frantic smear campaign, whispering his version of our life together to anyone in our social circle who would listen. He painted me as a woman who had become cold, calculating, and mentally unstable, suggesting that my recent dullness was actually a symptom of a psychological breakdown. He went as far as to coordinate a major profile interview with a high-tier lifestyle magazine, intending to rebrand himself as the long-suffering, saintly partner who was carrying the weight of a crumbling relationship while single-handedly running an empire. He thought he was winning, regaining the control he felt slipping away by making me the villain in his story of triumph over adversity. He assumed that by attacking my character, he could explain away his recent professional failures as the result of the emotional toll I was taking on him. What he failed to realize was that as a reputation architect, I had anticipated this move 5 years before he even had the audacity to conceive it. I had seen the seed of this betrayal in his eyes long ago, and I had already laid the legal groundwork to ensure his mouth would become his most expensive liability. The morning the magazine reached out for my comment on his claims, I didn't call Mark to argue. I simply called my personal attorney. An hour later, a hand-delivered envelope was placed on Mark's desk at his office. Inside was a reminder of the non-disclosure agreement he had signed in the early days of his ascent. At the time, Mark had signed it with a smirk, believing it was a tool I was providing to protect his secrets from me. He had been so blinded by his own greed and his desire to hide his messy past that he hadn't scrutinized the fine print I had meticulously drafted. I had inserted a comprehensive morality and non-disparagement clause, one that was tied directly to his personal equity and the valuation of his firm. This wasn't a standard gag order, it was a financial guillotine. The clause stated that any attempt, public or private, to tarnish my reputation or disclose the nature of my professional involvement in his career would trigger an immediate and massive financial penalty. Because Mark had insisted on using my personal reputation as a guarantee for his firm's early lines of credit, a violation of this clause wouldn't just be a legal headache. It would trigger a default on his corporate loans, effectively bankrupting his company in a matter of days. The high-drama moment occurred that evening when I walked into his study. He was white-faced, holding the document as if it were a live grenade. He tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for the words to yell at me to call me a traitor to continue the smear he had started. But he stopped. He looked at the bolded figures in the penalty section numbers that represented every cent he had worked for and every luxury he had come to depend on. For the first time in our relationship, I saw the exact moment Mark realized he was trapped in a cage of his own making. Every insult he had prepared, every lie he wanted to tell the magazine, and every derogatory remark he had shared over dinner now had a price tag attached to it, a price tag in the six-figure range per infraction. He was a man who thrived on the sound of his own voice, a man who believed his words could reshape reality, and he had just discovered that I had effectively bought his silence years ago. He was forced into the very role he had mocked me for, the quiet, sidelined partner who had to weigh every word for fear of the consequences. The enforced silence was more agonizing for him than any public scandal could have been. I watched him sit through subsequent social gatherings, his face a mask of repressed fury, unable to explain why his grand interview had been suddenly canceled due to scheduling conflicts. He had to sit there while people asked about my health, forced to offer polite, neutral responses because a single disparaging slip-up would cost him a fortune he no longer had the stability to lose. He was living in a state of constant, suffocating restraint. He would look at me across our living room, his eyes burning with the things he couldn't say, while I sat calmly reading a book, the picture of the boring woman he had so recently despised. The irony was exquisite. The man who had publicly shamed me for not being interesting was now legally mandated to be the most uninteresting man in the room. He was discovered that his power was an illusion, a temporary gift I had allowed him to use until he proved himself unworthy of the responsibility. He was finally learning that in the world of high-stakes reputation, the loudest person is rarely the one in control. For the first time in his life, he had a story to tell, and for the first time, he discovered that silence isn't a choice. It's a luxury he can no longer afford. The silence I had enforced through the law was merely the prelude to the silence the market was about to impose on Mark's entire existence. As the weeks progressed, the structural rot I had allowed to fester finally reached the foundation of his company. Mark's firm was in the final stages of a career-defining merger with a global conglomerate, a deal that would have solidified his status as a titan of industry. However, a transaction of that magnitude requires a rigorous reputational audit, a deep dive into the personal and professional risks of the leadership. In years past, I would have spent months preempting this audit, sanitizing Mark's digital footprint, and managing the narratives of former employees and disgruntled associates. This time, I did absolutely nothing. I watched from the periphery as the auditors uncovered his recent erratic behavior, his public outbursts, and the trail of unresolved indiscretions I had once worked so hard to bury. Without my constant management of his risk profile, Mark was no longer seen as a brilliant visionary. He was viewed as a volatility, a liability that no serious board of directors was willing to underwrite. During the final boardroom meeting, which I followed through the hushed, panicked phone calls Mark made in the hallway, the conglomerate withdrew their offer. They didn't cite a single scandal. They simply stated that the leadership did not align with their standards of governance. I didn't have to say a word. I let the cold, indifferent logic of the market deliver the execution that Mark had invited the moment he decided I was expendable. The professional collapse bled instantly into his social reality, culminating in the annual Winter Gala, an event Mark had expected would be his coronation. He dressed with an aggressive sort of confidence, unaware that the news of his failed merger had already traveled through the elite circles like a silent wildfire. When we arrived, he moved toward the center of the room, expecting the usual swarm of sycophants and admirers, but as we stepped into the ballroom, he found himself standing in a dead zone. It was a phenomenon I had seen happen to fallen politicians and disgraced moguls, but Mark was experiencing it for the first time. People didn't hiss or point. They simply looked through him. They turned their backs with a synchronized, polite grace, engaging in deep conversations the moment he drew near. He realized with a dawning horror that drained the color from his face that the friends he thought he had were actually my clients, my associates, or people who had only tolerated him because of the halo I provided. Without my silent endorsement, he was socially invisible and professionally toxic. I walked beside him, receiving warm nods and discreet smiles from the very people who refused to acknowledge his existence. I was still the woman they respected. He was now just the man who had been foolish enough to disrespect me. He was standing in the middle of a crowded room, more alone than he had ever been in his life, finally understanding that his status was never his own. It was a temporary loan I had just recalled. The final face-off happened 48 hours later in the quiet, sterile atmosphere of his now empty office. The boxes were packed, the assistant I had hired for him was gone, and the silence was absolute. I didn't come to argue, and I certainly didn't come to gloat. I simply placed a leather-bound folder on his desk containing the final dissolution paperwork for our engagement and a summary of the assets that would remain in my control. Mark looked at me, his eyes hollowed out by the sheer speed of his descent, and he tried one last time to blame me for his ruin. He accused me of destroying him, of sabotaging his deal, and of poisoning his reputation. I waited for him to finish his tirade, my expression as neutral as a blank ledger. When he finally ran out of breath, I leaned forward and spoke with a calm that was far more devastating than any shout. I told him that I had done nothing but stay out of his way. I explained that I hadn't leaked a single secret, or made a single phone call to stop his merger. All I had done was de-risk my own life by removing him from it. I revealed the truth he had been too arrogant to see I didn't destroy him. I simply stopped being his insurance policy. He sat there, the weight of the realization finally crushing him. He had spent years believing he was the pilot when he was actually just the passenger, and now that the pilot had stepped away, he was realizing he didn't know how to fly. I told him that he was now officially too expensive for the world to keep. In the circles of the high elite, reputation is the only currency that matters, and his was now in the negatives. No bank would lend to him. No board would seat him, and no one in that ballroom would ever answer his calls again. He wasn't being punished, he was being deleted. I stood up, adjusted my coat, and looked at the man I had built from nothing. He looked smaller than the broker I had met 7 years ago, stripped of the bespoke armor I had provided. I had given him everything: a name, a career, a future, and he had thrown it away for the fleeting thrill of a public insult. As I turned to leave, I saw him reach for his phone, perhaps to call a lawyer or a friend, only to realize there was no one left on the other end of the line. "I didn't destroy your career, Mark. I just stopped pretending you were the one who built it." The door to Mark's office clicked shut behind me, a soft, final sound that resonated more deeply than any scream of fury ever could. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the crisp morning air of the city filling my lungs with a clarity I hadn't felt in 7 years. My exit was as quiet as my presence had always been, but the world I left behind was irrevocably changed. I didn't move on to a flashy new executive role or jump into the arms of another high-profile suitor to prove my worth. I had nothing left to prove to a social circle that traded in shadows and mirrors. Instead, I transitioned into a phase of my life I call my legacy work. I began selecting a few highly specific projects using my expertise as a reputation architect to help other women who had spent their lives building empires for men who didn't deserve them. I helped them secure their financial independence, tighten their legal protections, and reclaim the intellectual property of their own lives before they could be discarded. My victory was not in the destruction of one man, but in the empowerment of a collective of women who had finally realized that their quietness was their greatest untapped asset. I moved into a smaller, more refined home by the coast, surrounded by books and art that I actually enjoyed, rather than the pieces Mark thought would impress his investors. For the first time, my life was no longer a curated performance for someone else's benefit. It was a masterpiece of my own design, clean, quiet, and absolute. Mark's new reality became a footnote in the industry newsletters I occasionally glanced at. He didn't vanish entirely, but he was diminished in a way that was far more satisfying than a total disappearance. Stripped of the protective layer I had provided, he was forced to relocate to a mid-sized city in the Midwest, taking a mid-level consultancy job where his name carried no weight, and his visionary talk was seen as nothing more than dated arrogance. He lived in the shadow of the man he used to be, a ghost of a CEO who spent his evenings in unremarkable bars telling anyone who would listen about the big deals he used to close and the ungrateful woman who cost him everything. But no one really listened anymore. There was no grand apology from him, no cinematic moment where he fell to his knees and begged for forgiveness, and I realized I didn't need one. His silence was now a permanent condition of his life, a forced humility that served as a constant reminder of the day he mistook my composure for weakness. I felt a profound sense of peace knowing that the fake king had been returned to the dust from which I had raised him. The system hadn't been cruel to Mark. It had simply been honest. Without a woman to hold up the mirror of his greatness, he was forced to look at his own reflection, and he finally saw what I had seen at that dinner table. A man who was in every sense of the word uninteresting. As I sit on my terrace today watching the tide pull back from the shore, I often find myself thinking about that first dinner party. I recall the way the laughter rippled around the table, the sharp mocking sound of people who thought they were in on a joke that I was the punchline of. For a long time, that sound had a sharp edge, but now it has no power over me at all. I realize now that their laughter was the greatest gift Mark could have given me. It was the catalyst that forced me to stop playing a role that was too small for me. It reminded me that the most powerful person in any room is rarely the one holding the microphone or the one at the head of the table. The most powerful person is the one who is listening, the one who is observing, and the one who understands that information is the only true currency. I was the architect of the room, the one who knew the structural integrity of every ego present, and they had been foolish enough to laugh at the very person holding the blueprints. I had walked away not just from a man, but from a version of myself that was willing to be invisible for the sake of another's ego. I had reclaimed my dignity, my intellect, and my future, and I had done it without breaking a single law or raising my voice once. The lesson I carry with me, and the one I whisper to the women I now mentor, is that hidden strength is the most lethal kind of power. We are taught that to be influential, we must be loud, we must be assertive, and we must constantly demand our seat at the table. But there is a different kind of authority that comes from being the one who builds the table in the first place. When you know your own value, you don't need to shout it from the rooftops. You simply wait for the moment when your absence will be felt more than your presence ever was. My life is now a testament to that silence. I am a symbol of a dignity that cannot be bought and a strength that cannot be intimidated. I look back at the woman I was in that charcoal silk dress, and I smile, not with bitterness, but with the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. I am no longer the supportive fiancé or the silent witness. I am the woman who knows exactly how the world works, and I am the woman who decided that I am more than enough on my own. They laughed because they thought I was boring. I walked away knowing they would never have the courage to laugh at a woman like me again. Would you have stayed, or would you have let the silence do the talking? I hope this journey of strategic silence and calculated justice resonated with you as deeply as it did with me. If you found satisfaction in seeing Sam reclaim her power from those who dared to underestimate her, please consider subscribing to our channel and joining our community of strong, discerning women. We want to hear from you. Was Sam's cold, systemic withdrawal of protection more satisfying than a loud confrontation? How would you have reacted if someone humiliated you at a dinner table full of peers? Your stories and perspectives are the heartbeat of this channel, and we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below to spark a conversation on dignity and hidden strength. Perhaps you have seen a Mark Davenport in your own life, or maybe you have mastered the art of being the most powerful person in the room by simply listening. Every like and comment helps us bring more of these sophisticated stories of resilience and payoff to light. Thank you for staying until the very end, and remember that the most dangerous weapon you possess is often the one you choose not to use until the moment is exactly right. Stay strong, stay observant, and keep the silence talking.